Friends, so a couple of days ago the Australian Federal Police raided a home of a journalist at Newscorp. Not a fan of Newscorp, it's a Murdoch-owned news and quote source, but incriminating surveillance that the Australian government have been doing. They used to say that they were only collecting metadata, but it would appear, of course you would expect this, that once they say they're collecting different things of Australians on emails, etc., that it's going to be more invasive than that. And I suppose under the instruction of the right-wing Australian government we have at the moment, probably we're instructed to, it's a form of harassment basically. Anyway, today they continued, the Australian Federal Police raided the ABC Sydney headquarters, and they were looking for all sorts of digital information about these two journalists who had released this thing called the Afghan Files. The Afghan Files are by two ABC investigative journalists, Dan Oakes and Sam Clark, and they revealed a series of allegations of unlawful killings and misconduct by the Australian Special Forces in Afghanistan, and were based off hundreds of pages of secret defence documents leaked to the ABC. Now, isn't this interesting? This is what the Australian Federal Police were searching for, and they took about 50 files, and so it looks like they're going to go after a whistleblower, whoever leaked those documents to the ABC. See, this is interesting, and of course there was a whole lot of people on Twitter, a whole lot of journalists on Twitter, a whole lot of high-profile people on Twitter, Australians, who were sort of outraged by this. You know, that they're going into the Australian Broadcasting Commission and in the Sydney headquarters at the Australian Federal Police, and basically taking those files. And these same people, I think there was probably none of those people were complaining when Julian Assange has been persecuted and vilified these last 7 years when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy as a political prisoner, for fear of leaving, that the US would extradite him, which was all based in fact that his fears were founded with the 175 years imprisonment that was awaiting him if he was extradited to the US under espionage, the Espionage Act. So Julian Assange is a journalist, he's a publisher, and all he was doing was what journalists do every single day, just like this happened today, where those two journalists at the ABC received leaked information from a whistleblower about the Australian Special Forces committing war crimes in Afghanistan. Sounds familiar? And yet these same people, these high-profile Australians and these Australian journalists, and I use that word lightly with a lot of them, they're really just stenographers for in the Murdoch press, but these same people have said nothing about Julian Assange, or if they have, they've been vilifying him, except only recently when they've seen, this is even before this, when they realized that they could be also a victim of extradition by the US for revealing anything that is inconvenient to the US empire and their war crimes or their political corruption. So they recognized that finally, that their lives were at threat. They didn't care about Julian Assange, and they don't particularly care about freedom of the press because they don't practice it themselves really. They don't value a free press really, but when it comes to their own careers and their own lives, that's when they start to freak out. So they didn't do that. It's only just recently that they've started talking about Julian Assange only in relation to their own, valuing their own career and their own lives, realizing this is a threat to press freedoms. So, you know, kudos for finally waking up. It's too bad, though, that you've let this poor man, Julian Assange, whose only crime is journalism, in quotes, his only crime is journalism, that you've left him twist in the wind, and basically I don't even know what's going on with Julian Assange right now. The last thing I heard was that he was in a gravely ill and could barely speak, and he was in the Belmarsh the Belmarsh prison, the hospital ward there, whatever that means. So, that's the latest. That's all I've heard about Julian Assange. Who knows what's going on with him? Anyway, so they've just left him sort of to twist in the wind, and basically he could die in Belmarsh prison. But now they've recently caught up and realised that their jobs and their lives are at stake if they can be extradited to the US, just like Julian Assange. And here we have, right now, with our right-wing Australian government under Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton, who's just a thug, who, is in charge, I think, of it's the equivalent of Homeland Security in the United States. It's a nice little fascist wing that's been put together, from what I understand. So anyway, the Australian Federal Police officers, are doing Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton's bidding, but I'm sure that behind all of that too is the US sort of also pulling the strings, because basically if they have every government under their thumb, which they pretty much have anyway, no matter who's in government in Australia, we're just a vassal state, we're just a US lackey. But I mean, they really can do what they can really give some full-on orders to Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton, because they absolutely do not care. They do not care about democracy, and they are sort of budding fascists. I'd say that Peter Dutton he's an unhinged, unfortunate person. He really is. He's a real, really racist, Islamophobic, and sort of, sort of a real, that kind of head kicker sort of person. But anyway, so Dan, I'm assuming Dan Oakes and Sam Clark, who were the journalists who received that leak by whomever that whistleblower is, who's probably in the Australian Defence Forces and witnessed these various things. Those two people probably will be in some sort of trouble, I imagine, and the whistleblower, of course, certainly will. So when I find out, what's happening there, I'm sure they'll find out who that whistleblower is. But the Afghan files is it's not surprising to me. That was released a couple of years ago, the Afghan files, and you can see that on the ABC website, abc.net.au, I think. Just search Afghan files and look for Dan Oakes and Sam Clark, and you find a whole list of different sort of things that which would go on I can be certain goes on every single day. The US soldiers engage in this, I know, because we've all heard the stories or whatever. We've seen collateral murder, so it's not surprising that this goes on with the Australian Special Forces. And ironically, there's one particular person who was a soldier who was given the highest honour in Australia, the most decorated soldier. I think his name is Ben Robert Smith. I think that's his name. First name is Ben. He received the Victoria Cross, and he's been highly, sort of held up on a pedestal. And in Australia, and he may have even received Australian of the Year, and he gave an award to a person following him, Rosie Batty, I think, who was talking about domestic violence. And then, you find out that Mr. Robert Smith has done war crimes in Afghanistan and has beaten up unarmed people, has shot people and killed them. He's been alleged to have been involved in domestic violence. The irony, giving an Australian of the Year award to somebody who is, sort of involved in promoting anti-domestic violence things. It's always the way, isn't it? But anyway, so there's a whole lot of a cloud around Ben Robert Smith, and that he also was bullying other people in the armed forces, and basically a real bully and attacking unarmed people. And but the whole list of in the Afghan files of war crimes, and I have to say before I go on, war is a crime. The whole thing is a crime, and this occupation of Afghanistan and all these other countries in the Middle East. It's appalling, and there's not even any question anymore. I mean, there's no anti-war movement really to speak of in Australia, and there's no question by any journalists about what on earth we're doing in Afghanistan. And then you read about sort of these poor Afghan citizens who are unarmed. Like there's one instance of a child being shot while they're sleeping and killed, there's all this sort of these secret rules of engagement that really, they just, shooting people on motorcycles and who they think are spotters, and somebody who was interrogating some people in a tent, some Australian soldier, when the two other soldiers left, apparently he'd taken these plastic handcuffs off him, and then the next thing, there's a shot and the guy is dead. The unarmed Afghani citizen is dead, and he was reaching for my rifle, this sort of thing. I mean, it's just a whole long list, and I'll leave a link to it because I'm not going to go through all of it. But there was an instance where two teenagers, Afghan teenagers, and 3 donkeys were killed in a helicopter fire incident. It's just, it's the sort of thing that goes on, sadly, every single day in Afghanistan and Iraq and so forth. This occupation, this brutal occupation by U.S. forces, along with other Western allies, including my own country, and it's appalling. It's appalling to read these leaked documents, but it's not surprising. It's appalling in that it's just more of the awful, awful, awful things that go on every single day in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. We, as many veterans have said who've come back and become peace activists, realize that they are the terrorists. We are the terrorists, and those people, and they call them insurgents, these people that want occupation to end. What makes one an insurgent? I mean, of course you want this awful murderous bunch of people who are just shooting unarmed citizens and terrifying people and going around from house to house and terrorizing families and so forth. Of course you would want them to leave. I would become an insurgent if I was living there. When I say an insurgent, I would have the same feelings that anybody who took up arms had. I would want them to get the hell out of my country. I don't believe in violence, but I mean, it's an appalling thing that there are just these occupational forces going around from house to house and terrorizing people and killing people and deciding who is an insurgent and who is not, and I'll kill them because my secret rules of engagement that nobody knows about, because you can't let the enemy know, otherwise they know what to do, and you've decided that person is a spotter and that person is a squirter. All these names for people that are suspicious. It's just sort of like, I don't know, it's just appalling, and we are still there. What on earth is Australia doing there? And the only reason we're there is because we are a U.S. lackey. We are a vassal state of the United States, and we just do. If they say jump, we say how high. I mean, I look at what we're, the sort of anti-Chinese rhetoric that's coming out now, and even, the journalism programs that were once not too bad many years ago, are just putting out, U.S. empire propaganda about, the Chinese and about Russia and all of that. This is sort of like, and I include the ABC in that. There is no journalists really to speak of in Australia that actually put out anything that's real or that is challenging. I mean, you get things like the Afghan files. So that was that was from the ABC, and I mean it always surprises me when you actually get something that's real that comes out. But it's becoming less and less likely, because particularly the ABC that's government funded, and the government keeps, the government's like Scott Morrison government that is, sort of a right-wing, sort of a right-wing government is always threatening to defund the ABC and has been trying to destroy it. But the Labor Party hasn't been so great either. That's the other major party. They haven't been so great trying to protect the ABC either. They've only just in the last election sort of, I think it's all for optics, sort of, we must protect the ABC. But really, the ABC has been going down the tubes for a while now. I don't bother with it. It just puts out nonsense like all the others. Maybe not as bad, and they do have some good programs, the ABC, but basically they don't challenge anything, and they just keep reinforcing the status quo. Anyway, so, it's just really interesting to see all these high-profile Australians and all these, journalists, in quotes, having a problem with this ABC being raided by the Australian Federal Police and also Newscorp, or as I like to call it, Newscorps, that some people have called it. They have been also raided and over the surveillance things, which and they're having, they're all up in arms about that and outraged. And yet here's Julian Assange. He's been doing exactly the same thing, releasing information that was leaked to him by, whistleblower Chelsea Manning. That's, WikiLeaks. It's a place that actually, holds governments to account like a journalist is supposed to do. They're supposed to report on political corruption. They're supposed to report on war crimes. That's all he's doing. He's doing journalism. That's all Julian Assange has been doing and all WikiLeaks has been doing. And there's nothing really that, as far as I understand, that they've ever released that has been false. Which is something you cannot say about the Australian journalists, in quotes, or you cannot say about American journalists, in quotes, or stenographers, as I like to call them. This is the hypocrisy. What's happening right now to journalists in Australia. Whistleblowers and journalists who report what they have leaked to them. And here we are all ignoring a hero, Julian Assange, and it doesn't matter whether you like him or not, ignoring him because USA, because the US government wants us to, has instructed us to. And I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere, if you were able to look through where this originated from, this measure to terrorize journalists in Australia over leaks of war crimes, there's somewhere in there's the US has been whispering in their ear, the government's ear, to start putting their foot on the necks of journalists in Australia. Now, they don't need any encouragement. The politicians in Australia, most of them don't need any encouragement to have a problem with journalists and that are actually reporting real stuff. And the Scott Morrison government and Peter Dutton certainly don't need any encouragement to persecute whistleblowers and to persecute journalists. So, but this is sort of like so hot on the heels of all this Julian Assange thing. It's like almost like a 100th monkey thing. So, this is sort of like, fascism creeping into Australia and right before our eyes. I rang up the Anthony Albanese today, who is now he is the federal opposition leader, the Labor Party. I asked the receptionist, and as usual, I asked, what does Mr. Albanese think about this raid by the Australian Federal Police on the ABC and also on Newscorp? And the person, as usual, this is what I get any time I ring up any of these politicians' offices. They know nothing. The people on the end of the phone are completely useless, or they pretend that they know nothing because they don't want to get into it. They don't want to admit. They don't want to, like I asked, what about Julian Assange? This is all related. He's just a journalist, a publisher who has released information by a whistleblower, Chelsea Manning, about war crimes, just like this Afghan Files thing. It's just that WikiLeaks has a much broader audience. It has they can upload millions of files, and, they have a much bigger punch in some ways, a much broader audience. And so that's why they're such a huge target. But the receptionist was absolutely useless. And I haven't heard Albanese, no surprises there. I haven't heard Albanese or Bill Shorten, who was the previous opposition leader of the Labor Party before that great loss to the Scott Morrison government a couple of weeks ago. Neither of them have said anything. The Labor Party, I'm not going to go into it, but not that I expected a whole lot from the Labor Party, but they're way below any sort of low expectations I had about press freedom. And I'll be surprised if maybe Anthony Albanese might say something because it's the ABC, but he won't mention Julian Assange and he won't connect the dots in front of us. It's just appalling. There were some other stories I wanted to talk about today, and I might actually finish this and then maybe post another couple, but because a lot of things happened in the last 24 hours. Here's one example of the sort of things that were in the Afghan files. In May, this is sort of not, there's children have been killed, like a man and his son were coming back from some medical clinic and they had pills and everything in their possession, just for their whatever illnesses they had. and these Australian Special Forces killed them, sort of saying that they thought that they were some sort of threat. So, and they found them with, there was no, and they always clear them with this, it was under the Australian rules of the rules of engagement. But anyway, in May 2009, an internal inquiry found that the Australian soldiers who killed 3 men during an assault on a compound were cleared, despite the fact that one of the dead was hiding in a pile of chaff, another was running away from the compound, and the third was hiding in a haystack. Sounds really dangerous, doesn't it? None of the 3 were armed, no weapons were found nearby, and none of the 8 Afghan men captured alive were questioned about the identities of the dead men. The officer who carried out the Australian officer who carried out the inquiry did not travel to the scene or question the local inhabitants. Despite all this, he determined the dead men, quote, acted in a manner consistent with taking a direct part in hostilities. That's a typical, end quote. That's a typical thing that they say, direct action in hostilities. Everybody's a suspect. It reminds me of the drone, when whistleblower Daniel Hale, who's in prison right now, another war on whistleblowers, of course, in the United States, and Chelsea Manning's a whistleblower, and she's in prison right now. Daniel Hale was saying how with the drone strikes, they just assume that everybody that's talking to their so-called target is a suspect that must be somehow in sort of some relationship, some kind of terrorist insurgent or whatever. That they're all suspect basically. So that means that's a great way of counting, sort of striking off anything civilian casualties, because you can just say that everybody that was killed was part of a group of insurgents or terrorists. And of course Donald Trump has actually made it now that they don't keep reports of how many civilians are killed. That's something that happened a couple of months ago. He basically made it so that they don't keep records of how many civilians are killed. So, but that's sort of similar. You can basically make up something that you think that those people are suspect, they're insurgents or whatever, and then you can kill them, and then you can say, well, it's under the rules of engagement. And I'll just say one thing about Mr. Robert Smith, the one that's the highly decorated Australian Special Forces soldiers. Fairfax, that's, another useless news source over here in Australia, alleges Mr. Robert Smith was involved in 6 unlawful killings in Afghanistan, including an alleged incident in 2012 in which he is said to have kicked Ali Jan, an unarmed and handcuffed Afghan man, off a cliff before directing a soldier under his command to shoot him. I mean, this is, I've heard numerous stories about Mr. Robert Smith, this highly decorated Australian Special Forces soldier, and I've read, some accounts by fellow soldiers who were bullied by him and who witnessed his sort of behavior, his pummeling, unarmed Afghan civilians, like belting them up and all that kind of thing. So, that's an alleged report, but I mean, it seems like he was definitely involved in definitely involved in actually shooting people in the head and things like that, from what I've understand from these reports. So, anyway, you can look through that. I really have to try not to think about it too much, because it makes me so angry that this is what we are doing to those people there, every single day. I mean, I don't know how they keep it together. I really don't. Because if this was happening to me or to, the town I was living in, if I had drones flying over and just bombing the bejesus out of people's places and killing families and terrorizing me and people near me, friends and etc., I don't, honestly, these people must have the patience of a saint. Who could blame them if they wanted to join and become sort of insurgents, in quotes? Who could blame them? Because it's outrageous. This is outrageous. And it makes me so angry when I read these things because I know this is going on every day. They say, these war crimes. The whole thing is a crime. War is a crime. Everything that's going on is a crime. Every single thing. Them being there is a crime. Stealing their resources, overthrowing their governments, internationally breaking international laws left and right. The war crimes, every single thing they're doing. The whole thing is a crime. And it just makes me so angry. I see this and I think, oh my God, these children. These children. That one child he was sleeping in a bed and he was just shot in the abdomen and died like 5 minutes later. And it doesn't matter if it was an accident or not. Who effing cares? It's just wrong that they're there. They shouldn't be there. Whether it's, what I mean? It's just wrong. And I'm appalled. I'm appalled that, I don't know how these Australian politicians live with themselves. Do they even look at what's going on, what we're involved in? And then they have the gall, the outrageous, the arrogance to refuse and put these people that are fleeing these countries into detention centres where it's like an Australian gitmo, and then they are psychologically tortured and physically tortured, and their children are sexually abused at times, and they are left there indefinitely, and they never know when they're going to leave on Manus Island and Christmas Island and the like. They don't know when they're going to leave. The psychological torture of all of that, and they self-harm and some kill themselves. And, that's what we're doing to these people that are fleeing this stuff, this appalling, this absolutely disgraceful. They're fleeing this. What's being reported in those Afghan files? All of the stuff that the US Army is doing there, which is outrageous. If you're from Australia, I invite you to look into the Eyes Left podcast, EYESLEFT podcast. It's two veterans, an Iraq veteran and an Afghan veteran, and it's a real eye-opener. I implore you to look at that, and also look at the Empire Files. I mention the Empire Files regularly because it's a really trustworthy site which reveals the crimes of U.S. empire. And I call it empire because it has 800 plus bases worldwide, and it's basically at the center of most of the violence, most of the wars, most of the regime change stuff that's going on in the world today. So I invite you to check that out, and I'll just give you one short story about one of the people they had on, Clifton Hicks. He was he's a veteran from the Afghan war, and he said the free fire, they would have free fire zones, and that happens where they just can shoot whomever. That's a regular thing that's been going on for since all these wars started, where they have free fire zones in Afghanistan and Iraq. And they came into a town, Abu Ghraib. And he said there was about, I don't know whether it was 600 or 800, I can't remember correctly, civilians all laying dead on the ground, including all the animals they had in the town. And basically the forces before them had gone in and just had a free fire and shot everybody, including the animals. Now that is a massive, that's like a My Lai situation, and that happens regularly. That is not uncommon. The collateral murder thing that Chelsea Manning leaked WikiLeaks to Julian Assange, that happens on a regular basis. That's almost a daily occurrence in Afghanistan and Iraq. Have you seen the collateral murder thing? Just mowing people down from the sky, including two Reuters journalists? And that's why Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange and WikiLeaks are being persecuted. That's one of the main reasons for exposing war crimes. So seriously, if you're an Australian and you're watching this and you are not an anti-war activist, please become one, because there are millions of lives at stake. There's 1 million plus, possibly even 2 million Iraqis dead now from these dreadful, dreadful, dreadful wars that we are participating in and doing this kind of dreadful, awful, awful stuff. I call it a war crime, but as I said, it's all a crime, the whole thing. It's a criminal venture, this whole thing of controlling other people's resources and overthrowing their government so they'll do the bidding of corporations and so forth. It's all about that. It's a capitalist, gangster, mafia sort of thing that we are involved in. And it has to end. So please start speaking out, because it's only when Australian citizens and globally people start speaking out about this awful stuff that they don't want you to know about. And that's why they're persecuting people like Julian Assange, journalists, and people like this Sam Oakes and I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name already. Those two journalists and whistleblowers, and they're going to persecute that whistleblower, whoever that person was. Even though the ABC says it's going to protect its sources, but they'll find out who it is. Because they're going to go through all those digital files and they'll finally track down who. I don't think the ABC is anywhere near as sophisticated as WikiLeaks. And they still found, they could still work out. They put one and one together, and Chelsea Manning knew that she was going to get found out anyway. Anyhow, so I implore people to please become anti-war activists and start speaking out about this, because we're only going to get dribs and drabs of the things that go on every single day, and it'll just chill journalism even more, even though there's hardly anybody talking about this. So check out those sites, the Empire Files, and also Eyes Left podcast, because it's that they're the real deal in journalism. And check out the Grey Zone Project. Anyway, I'm going to leave it here. I speak too long. I'm sorry. I sometimes think it's shorter than it is, and then I look up and it's 37 minutes. That's no good. I need to make these shorter. So anyway, thanks so much for watching. Please click the subscribe button if you like the content, and click the notifications bell, otherwise you don't receive updates. And please hit the like button if you like the content, and please leave comments. I always enjoy your comments and I appreciate them. So thanks so much for watching. You're watching Faint Signals from Vigo. My name is Trish Roberts. Till next time, bye for now.